Still renting that shoebox downtown? At 33? That's genuinely embarrassing. My sister didn't bother lowering her voice when she said it. She said it right there in the middle of my mother's 60th birthday dinner, surrounded by 40-something relatives and family friends who heard every single word. She waited a moment, then smiled and added, "Maybe by the time you're 40 you'll finally have a real address to be proud of." I smiled right back. Then I said, calmly and clearly, "Actually, I closed on my house 3 months ago." The table went completely quiet. My name is Renata. I'm 33 years old and I work as a senior environmental consultant for a mid-sized firm in Toronto. My job takes me across the province advising municipalities and construction companies on land remediation, wetland assessments, and sustainable site development. It's work I genuinely love, detailed, meaningful, and harder to explain at family dinners than it sounds on paper. But I had built a career I was proud of, one environmental impact report and site assessment at a time. None of that ever seemed to count for much at home. What counted, according to my family, was whether I owned property. In Toronto, in 2024, that felt like being asked whether I had personally discovered a cure for something. The market had crushed an entire generation of people who had done everything right, saved carefully, worked hard, lived within their means, and still couldn't break through. I understood that, I had lived that, but I had also been quietly working towards something for years in a way my family didn't know about, because I had learned long ago that sharing good news with certain people only gives them more material to work with. My sister was 2 years younger than me and had married at 27. Her in-laws had gifted them a substantial down payment on a semi-detached in Mississauga. Not something she ever mentioned when the topic of homeownership came up, but something the rest of us quietly knew. She had been handed a significant advantage and wore it like something she had earned entirely on her own. At every family gathering, she found a way to bring up the house, her equity, her garden, her finished basement, and at every gathering, she would eventually look at me with that particular kind of concern, the performative kind, and ask some variation of when I was going to stop throwing money away on rent. My parents never stopped her. My mother would smile uncomfortably and change the subject a few beats too slowly. My father would refill someone's drink. The signal was always the same. "This is not the hill we are dying on. Ignore it. You're the one who handles things well." I had been handling things well since I was 18. After university, I moved into the city on a junior salary and a level of determination that probably looked reckless from the outside. I shared apartments with 2, sometimes 3 roommates for years. I took on extra project contracts on weekends. I turned down vacations and said no to things I wanted. I maxed out my RRSP contributions every year, and when the first home savings account launched, I opened one immediately and treated it like a second job. Automatic transfers, no exceptions, no negotiating with myself at the end of the month. I did not tell my family any of this, not because I was embarrassed, but because I had learned that progress in our family was only ever acknowledged as a coincidence. Struggle was laughed at. Achievement was minimized. If I shared a goal before I reached it, it became a punchline. And if I reached it, it became something everyone had always expected of me anyway. My sister's favorite version of this was the year I got my professional designation. I had passed a grueling licensing exam after 2 years of study while working full-time. When I mentioned it at Christmas, quietly, because I never really announced things, she laughed and said, "Oh good, now you have a certificate to frame in that little apartment." My parents chuckled. The conversation moved on. I stopped mentioning things after that. There was one person who knew everything. I had met him at a project site outside of Hamilton about 2 years before my mother's birthday party. His name was Julian, and he was the structural engineer on a commercial development I had been contracted to review. We met during a site walk in October, both of us in muddy boots and hard hats, arguing politely about the grading plan near a protected drainage corridor. By the third site visit, we had stopped arguing and started having lunch together instead. Julian was quiet in the way that meant he was actually listening. He asked questions no one in my family had ever thought to ask, about the work, about what I found satisfying in it, about what I had given up to get where I was. He remembered specific things I said weeks later. He never once asked me when I was planning to buy a place, but when I mentioned I was working toward it seriously, he asked what my timeline looked like and whether I had looked into the FHSA rebates for first-time buyers. And then he listened, while I talked through the whole plan without trying to redirect the conversation to himself. He came to one family dinner about 8 months after we started dating. He was polite, a little reserved, and handled himself well in a room full of people who asked questions primarily to redirect the conversation back to themselves. On the drive home, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Does your sister always frame things that way?" I said she was just teasing. He said, "She's been having a competition with you all evening that you're not participating in." That's not the same as teasing. I didn't know what to say to that. He kept his eyes on the road and added, "You don't have to shrink yourself to make her comfortable. That's not kindness. That's accommodation." Nobody had ever said it to me that plainly before. By the spring before my mother's party, two things had happened that my family knew nothing about. First, I had found a house, a detached century home in Hamilton's Kirkendall neighborhood, close enough to Toronto for work and far enough from it to breathe. It needed new windows and the kitchen hadn't been updated since the 90s. But the bones were right, the lot was generous, and after a home inspection and several rounds of paperwork, I signed the deed and handed over a check that represented 4 years of very deliberate sacrifice. Second, Julian had proposed over a quiet dinner in February. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We decided not to tell my family right away. Not because we were ashamed, but because we had both seen, up close, what happened when I brought things to that table before I was ready. We wanted the house to be ours first, to paint the walls, fix the upstairs bathroom window, plant something in the backyard, before it became a subject for commentary. We wanted the engagement to be real and settled before it became a performance. Neither of us expected the moment to arrive the way it did. My mother's 60th birthday party was held at a banquet hall she had booked herself, the kind with cream linens, and a cash bar, and a photo slideshow running on loop near the entrance. Julian had come separately because a site meeting ran late, and I had helped my mother set up in the afternoon. He was planning to arrive around 7. It was just past 6:30, when my sister found me near the dessert table. And I should have known from the way she moved through the room, slowly, pulling a cousin in to step beside her, building an audience before she arrived, that she had already planned something. She casual observation wrapped in concern. "So how are things going in the city?" she asked. "Same building?" I said yes, still the same neighborhood. She tilted her head. "How long has it been now?" "Almost 7 years renting." "About that," I said. She made a face, the kind designed to look sympathetic while functioning as a verdict. Around us, a small cluster of relatives had drifted closer without appearing to. My mother was across the room. My father was at the bar. Then she raised her glass slightly and said it loud enough that the nearest 2 tables went quiet. "Still renting that shoebox downtown? At 33? That's genuinely embarrassing." She let it settle, then added the rest of it. "Maybe by the time you're 40, you'll finally have a real address to be proud of." A few people laughed uncertainly. A cousin looked at the floor. My aunt, standing just behind the small circle that had formed, pressed her lips together. I remember the feeling very clearly, not embarrassment, something closer to a decision, the kind of calm that comes after years of absorbing the same hit in the same way, and finally reaching the point where you stop. I smiled at my sister. I waited until the laughter faded. Then I said, "Actually, I closed on my house 3 months ago." She blinked. Then she laughed, the dismissive kind, the kind meant to signal that what you just said doesn't count yet. "Okay, Renata," she said, glancing sideways at the cousin next to her. "She's embarrassed, so she's—" "I'm not embarrassed," I said. "I'm telling you something true." She stopped. Around us, people had gone very still. I reached into my bag and took out my phone. I had the photos already. Not because I had planned this specifically, but because I had been sending renovation updates to Julian all month, and they were right there in my camera roll. I turned the screen toward her. The house in November with the old windows still in, the kitchen with its original avocado tile, the backyard in early spring. Julian crouched beside a fence section we had patched together on a Saturday afternoon. "That's," she started. "Mine," I said. "Bought with my own savings, no gifted down payment, no family contribution." I said it without heat, but I let it land the way it was meant to. Around us, a few relatives were quietly connecting things they had not considered before. The door at the far end of the hall opened. Julian came in, still in his work shirt, carrying a wrapped gift and scanning the room until he found my face. He crossed toward me without hesitating. "Sorry I'm late," he said and kissed me on the cheek. He smiled at the small group and extended his hand. "I'm Julian. Really nice to finally meet everyone." My sister looked at him, then at me, then at the ring on my left hand, which she had not noticed because I wore it turned slightly inward at family events out of old habit. Julian's hand was in mine, and both rings were visible now. "You're engaged," she said. It came out flat, like a fact she was trying to disprove without the evidence to do it. "We are," I said. "Since when?" "February," Julian said easily without apology. The room had reorganized itself without anyone planning it. The people who had laughed at my sister's joke a few minutes earlier were now standing in the awkward position of having laughed at the wrong thing, and they knew it. My aunt, my mother's older sister, who had driven in from Burlington and had been watching the whole evening with the expression of someone sitting on too many thoughts, stepped forward and said quietly but clearly, "Congratulations, sweetheart. I would love to hear about the house." I showed her the photos. She passed my phone to the cousin beside her. It moved around the circle. My mother appeared at the edge of the group. When she spoke, her voice was careful and small. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked. I had thought about my answer to that question for a long time. "Because I needed it to be mine first," I said. "Every time I've shared something with this family before I was ready, it stopped being the thing and started being a topic. I didn't want that." Then at my father, who had walked over and was standing very still. "And I wasn't sure I'd be congratulated. I thought I'd be questioned. Where is it? What did you pay? Can you actually carry the mortgage on your own?" My father looked away. My mother's mouth tightened. "That's not fair," my sister said. The performance had gone out of her voice. What was left was harder to read, part anger, part something that might have been the beginning of something more honest. "You called where I live a shoebox," I said. "In front of 40 people. I've been listening to versions of that for years. Tonight, I just answered the question you actually asked." Nobody defended her. That, more than anything else, seemed to reach her. She was used to at least one parent stepping in to smooth it over. This time, my father set his drink down and said nothing. My mother looked at her hands. My aunt was the one who broke the silence. "I've watched this for a very long time," she said, to no one in particular and everyone at once. "I always told myself it wasn't my place. I should have said something years ago." She looked at my sister with the particular patience of someone who loves you enough to be honest. "This isn't a one-time thing, sweetheart. Tonight is just the night." Someone held up a mirror. My sister's partner had been standing slightly to one side through all of this. He was not dramatic about what he did next. He simply came over, introduced himself to Julian with a handshake and genuine warmth, and then said to my sister quietly but without softening it, "Can we talk later? Just us." She looked at him. He didn't walk it back. She nodded once. The rest of the evening continued the way these things do. The slideshow kept running, people returned to their conversations, the bar stayed open, but the air was different. Julian stayed close to me, and my aunt kept finding reasons to talk to us, asking about the house, the neighborhood, what we were doing with the kitchen. It was the most interested anyone in my family had been in my actual life in a very long time. In the days that followed, my phone started receiving messages. My aunt called first and apologized specifically, not in a vague, covering her bases way, but with detail. She mentioned a particular dinner from years earlier and said she had laughed when she should have spoken up, and that it had stayed with her. I hadn't expected that level of precision. It meant she had been paying attention all along. The cousin who had been standing next to my sister texted to say she was glad I'd said something, and that she had noticed the same dynamics for years without knowing how to name them. Other relatives reached out in their own ways, each one slightly different in how fully they were willing to name what they had witnessed. My sister did not contact me. What I heard, through others, was that her partner had asked her a lot of questions she hadn't been prepared for. He had grown up in a family where teasing had clear limits, and what he had witnessed at the party had genuinely unsettled him. He wasn't ending the relationship, but he told her, from what I understood, that he needed to understand who he was actually with. Not the version she presented to people who already loved her, but the version that existed when she was unchallenged, and someone else was available to diminish. I didn't feel victorious when I heard that. I had imagined for years that some kind of public reckoning would feel satisfying. What it actually felt like was tired, and then, slowly, over the following days, unexpectedly light. My own life kept moving. Julian and I spent weekends at the house stripping wallpaper in the upstairs hallway and arguing, pleasantly, about whether the kitchen should be painted white or a deep, warm green. We had the windows replaced before winter. I planted perennials in the backyard in March that wouldn't bloom until spring, which felt like a specific kind of faith in the future. At work, I was offered the lead role on a provincial wetlands restoration project running 18 months. Exactly the kind of work I had been building toward since I started in the field. Several weeks after the party, my mother called and asked if we could meet for coffee. She had chosen a cafe near her neighborhood, and she was already there when I arrived, which told me she had thought carefully about it beforehand. She didn't make small talk for long. "We owe you an apology," she said. "Your father and I both." She looked out the window. "We told ourselves we were keeping the peace. We put too much on you because you were the one who could absorb it. We thought not taking sides meant staying neutral. Looking back, I can see it just meant staying comfortable." She looked at me. "That wasn't fair to you." I had waited a long time for those words, and when they came they felt smaller than I had imagined. Not because they weren't genuine, but because I understood, sitting across from her, that this conversation was a beginning, not an arrival. "I believe you mean that," I said. "And I forgive you, not because it didn't matter, but because I've been carrying it long enough, and carrying it isn't helping me anymore." She nodded. Her eyes were bright. "But forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing," I continued. "I need to see how things go, whether this is a conversation or the start of something different." She didn't ask me to soften it. She just said quietly, "That's fair." My father had sent me a short email that same week. He wasn't a man who made phone calls about difficult things, but the email was direct and took responsibility, without making excuses for himself. I wrote back and said I had read it, and that I meant it when I said I was open to rebuilding things, slowly and on honest ground. My sister eventually sent a message. It was brief and didn't fully name what she had done, which was disappointing but not surprising. She said she hadn't meant for things to get to where they had, and that she hoped we could move past it. I read it several times. Then I replied and said I hoped so too, but that moving past it would require her to actually understand it first, and that I wasn't ready to tell her things were fine before I knew whether they were. She didn't respond for a long time after that. Our first Thanksgiving in the new house was that October, about 10 months after the birthday party. Julian's parents came in from Guelph. My aunt drove down from Burlington. 2 close friends from work filled out the table. We made a roast and a squash soup from a recipe Julian's mother had written out by hand on an index card, and entirely too much pie. The kitchen was warm and full of voices and the particular kind of noise that comes from people who are genuinely glad to be in the same room. At some point in the evening, I was standing at the counter cutting bread, and Julian came up beside me. He said quietly, "How does it feel?" He meant the house, the evening, all of it. I thought about it for a moment. "Like mine," I said. And he smiled and went back to the table, and that was enough. I think about my mother's birthday party sometimes. Not with anger, though the anger was real for a long time. I think about it the way you think about a moment that changed the shape of something. A pressure point that finally gave way in the right direction. My sister had spent years believing that pointing at my life was a way of elevating her own. What she hadn't considered was that I had been building something. She couldn't see, because I had deliberately kept it out of reach of anyone who might have turned it into a punchline before it was finished. The house didn't make me better than her. The ring didn't. The career didn't. What changed things was a decision I had made slowly, over many years, without quite naming it, to stop waiting for anyone in that family to confirm what I already knew about myself, and to stop showing up to rooms where I offered someone the chance to take that from me. Once that changed, it turned out everything else could follow.